Harlem had a way of holding two worlds in the same breath. On one side of Lenox Avenue, music spilled from open doors, laughter bounced off brick walls, and the rhythm of life moved fast and loud. On the other, behind a narrow glass storefront with gold-trimmed lettering that read Riverside Dining, silence ruled. It was the kind of silence that came from money, from rules written in invisible ink, from the belief that respect was something you purchased, not something you earned. For Lila Brooks, that silence pressed against her chest every morning as she tied her apron, smoothed her uniform, and reminded herself why she stayed. She needed the job. Her mother needed medication. Her younger brother needed tuition money. And Harlem, for all its warmth, didn't forgive missed rent. Riverside Dining had been there for decades, but it never truly belonged to the neighborhood. The owner, Mr. Calvin Whitmore, liked to say the restaurant was a refined escape from the chaos outside. He said it often, especially when staff meetings turned into lectures about posture, tone, and knowing one's place. Lila knew exactly what he meant by chaos. He meant people who looked like her, people who spoke with heart instead of polish, people whose stories were etched into their hands instead of their resumes. Still, she showed up every day with her chin lifted and her voice gentle, because kindness, she believed, was a form of resistance. That afternoon began like any other. The lunch crowd was thin, the sunlight slanted through tall windows, and dust danced lazily above white tablecloths. Lila moved from table to table with quiet efficiency, memorizing orders, refilling water glasses before they were empty, offering small smiles that went mostly unnoticed. Then the door opened and the room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the air to shift, for a few heads to turn, for a murmur to ripple like a breeze through leaves. The man who entered wore a simple dark suit and a calm expression, the kind that didn't demand attention but received it anyway. His hair was neatly combed, his posture relaxed, his eyes curious in a way that suggested he was observing more than he was judging. To Lila, he looked like someone's grandfather, someone's mentor, someone who had lived long enough to understand that humility was not weakness. He paused at the entrance, glanced around the dining room, and smiled softly. As if remembering something from another life, Lila was the first to approach him. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice warm but professional. "Would you like a table?" He nodded. "Near the window, if possible," he replied, his voice smooth, almost musical. Carrying a gentle familiarity that made her feel at ease, she led him to a small table overlooking the street, where Harlem pulsed just beyond the glass. As she set down a menu, he looked out the window for a long moment, watching a street musician tune his guitar. "This neighborhood has soul," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "It does," Lila agreed. "You just have to listen." He smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. "What's your name?" "Lila." "Well, Lila," he said, folding the menu closed. "I trust your recommendation." She suggested the daily special, a simple dish prepared with care, and he accepted without hesitation. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she felt something she hadn't felt at work in a long time seen. Not inspected. Not evaluated. Just seen from across the room, Mr. Whitmore noticed. He stood near the bar, arms crossed, watching the exchange with a tightening jaw. He recognized the man, of course. Anyone in the industry would. Dean Martin's name didn't need introduction, even decades later. His songs still played on late-night radios. His face still appeared in black-and-white memories. His presence still carried weight. But what bothered Whitmore wasn't the celebrity. It was the image. A legend seated near the window, served by a waitress from Harlem, laughing softly at something she said. It disrupted the atmosphere Whitmore believed he had curated. When Lila returned with the meal, Dean thanked her sincerely, asking about the neighborhood, about her family, about how long she'd worked there. She answered politely, carefully, aware that the invisible line servers were never meant to cross. Still, conversation flowed easily, like an old record spinning a familiar tune. Other customers noticed. Some smiled. Others frowned. One woman whispered something behind a manicured hand. Whitmore's patience thinned with every passing minute. He waited until Dean had finished eating, till Lila had cleared the table and offered dessert, which he declined with a gracious nod. As Dean reached for his wallet, Whitmore intervened, placing the bill on the table himself, with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "This one's on the house," he said, his tone tight. "We appreciate your visit." Dean looked up, surprised. "That's kind of you," he said. Then he turned to Lila. "Thank you for the wonderful service." "It was my pleasure," she replied. Dean stood, paused, and added softly, "Never lose that kindness. Lila, the world needs it." She watched him leave. Unaware that the moment would echo far beyond that door, the confrontation came immediately. "Office." "Now," Whitmore snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the room. Lila followed, her heart pounding, confusion clouding her thoughts. Inside the cramped office, Whitmore shut the door and turned on her with barely restrained anger. "What do you think you were doing?" he demanded. "I was serving a customer," she said carefully. "You were overfamiliar," he hissed. "Chatting, laughing, drawing attention. That is not the image we present here." "I was respectful," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He invited conversation. "That doesn't matter," Whitmore snapped. "People come here for discretion, not performances." She took a breath. "I didn't mean any disrespect." Whitmore scoffed. "Intent doesn't change perception, and perception is everything." He opened a drawer, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the desk. "You're done here. Effective immediately." The words didn't register at first. I don't understand." "You crossed the line," he said coldly. "Collect your things." Lila stood frozen, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. She thought of her mother's prescriptions, her brother's tuition notice. The rent is due in 2 weeks. She thought of Dean's kind eyes, his gentle words, and the irony of being punished for kindness. "Please," she said quietly. "I need this job." Whitmore looked away. "That's not my problem." She left Riverside Dining with her apron folded under her arm and tears burning behind her eyes. Stepping back into Harlem's noise as if surfacing from underwater, the street musician was still there, playing a slow, soulful tune. She paused, listening, letting the music steady her breathing. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere across the city, a phone was already ringing, and a chain of events had begun that would unravel everything Whitmore thought he controlled. Because kindness, once witnessed, has a way of multiplying, and regret, when it comes, never asks permission. Night fell over Harlem with a quiet dignity, the kind that wrapped itself around brick buildings and tired souls alike. Lila Brooks walked home slower than usual, her steps heavy, her thoughts louder than the city around her. Every sound felt sharper, the rumble of buses, the laughter spilling from a corner bar, the distant siren that rose and fell like a warning she couldn't escape. She replayed the afternoon again and again, searching for the moment she might have done something wrong, some invisible rule she'd broken without knowing it. But every version ended the same way. She had been kind. She had been professional, and she had been fired for it. Inside her small apartment, the lights flickered on with a tired hum. Her mother slept on the couch, medicine bottles neatly lined on the table beside her, their labels glowing under the lamp like quiet reminders of responsibility. Lila didn't wake her. She set her bag down, sank into a chair, and pressed her palms against her eyes until the sting eased. Tomorrow loomed like a cliff edge. No job, no backup plan. Just faith, and faith, she knew, didn't pay bills. Still, she whispered a small prayer. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for strength to face whatever came next, across the city, in a hotel suite overlooking a river that reflected the lights like scattered stars. Dean Martin sat alone with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside him. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock, each second measured and deliberate. He wasn't thinking about applause or stages or songs that had once carried his name across continents. He was thinking about a waitress in Harlem with tired eyes and a steady voice. About the way she had spoken of her neighborhood with pride instead of apology. He had seen something familiar in hers, something he recognized from a lifetime of rooms. Where kindness was rare and sincerity rarer still, Dean had lived long enough to know when a moment mattered. And that moment, brief as it was, refused to leave him. He reached for the phone. The call didn't go to Riverside Dining. Not yet. It went to someone who understood leverage, consequences, and timing. A man whose job it was to listen carefully when Dean Martin spoke. The conversation was short, quiet, and precise. No anger, no raised voice. Just facts laid out like dominoes waiting to fall. When Dean hung up, he looked out at the city and allowed himself a slow breath. He didn't know how things would unfold, only that they would. The next morning, Mr. Calvin Whitmore arrived at Riverside Dining earlier than usual. His mood sharp, his thoughts unsettled. He told himself he'd done the right thing. Discipline mattered. Image mattered. He repeated it like a mantra as he adjusted chairs and inspected table settings. Yet something felt off, a faint unease he couldn't quite name. The restaurant opened on time, staff moved quietly, and life resumed its orderly rhythm. Whitmore took comfort in that. Order always soothed him. Then the phone rang. It wasn't the front desk line. It was his private office phone, the one reserved for suppliers, investors, and people who didn't waste time. He frowned, answered, and listened. At first, his expression barely changed. Then his brows knit together. Then his grip tightened on the receiver. By the time the call ended, the color had drained from his face. He sat down slowly, the weight of what he'd just heard settling into his bones. There had been questions polite but pointed about staffing practices, about community relations, about how Riverside Dining treated people who represented its public face. There had been mentions of contracts, partnerships, and future considerations. Nothing explicit, nothing threatening. And yet everything about the call screamed warning. Whitmore prided himself on control. But control depended on predictability. And this was unpredictable. By midday, whispers began. A supplier delayed a delivery without explanation. A regular customer canceled a private event booking. A local paper requested a comment about employment practices in historic Harlem establishments. Whitmore felt the walls closing in, though no one had accused him of anything. Not yet. The silence, he realized, was worse than confrontation. Silence allowed imagination to work unchecked. Meanwhile, Lila spent her morning walking the neighborhood, handing out resumes with a polite smile that hid her growing anxiety. Each restaurant manager offered sympathy, but no promises. "We'll call," they said, and she nodded, knowing what those words usually meant. By afternoon, exhaustion tugged at her limbs. She sat on a bench near the same windowed storefront where Riverside Dining stood, watching life move on without her. She wondered if kindness had been a mistake, if survival required hardness instead. Her phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and unexpected. It wasn't an offer of a job. It wasn't an apology. It was an invitation to meet, to talk, to share her side of the story with someone who believed it mattered. The call ended with a simple assurance. Your integrity didn't go unnoticed. Leela stared at the screen long after it went dark, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Something was happening. She didn't know what it was, only that the story wasn't over. Back at Riverside Dining, Whitmore stood alone in his office as evening approached, the restaurant quieter than it should have been. For the first time in years, doubt crept in. Not doubt about business strategy or branding, but doubt about judgment. He thought of Lila's calm eyes, her respectful tone, the way Dean Martin had looked at her not as staff, but as a human being. Whitmore dismissed the thought, straightened his jacket, and told himself he could weather any storm. He was wrong, because storms born of quiet. Phone calls and unseen alliances don't announce themselves with thunder. They arrive slowly, deliberately, and by the time you recognize their power, it's already too late to outrun them, and somewhere between Harlem's restless streets and a river-lit skyline. The balance had begun to shift. By the third day, Harlem could feel it, not in headlines, not in gossip columns, but in the way conversations paused mid-sentence, in the way people glanced at Riverside Dining and lingered a second longer than usual. Something was shifting, and no one could quite name it yet. For Lila Brooks, that morning began with a restlessness she couldn't shake. She woke before her alarm, the echo of that unexpected phone call still ringing in her chest. Your integrity didn't go unnoticed. The words sounded comforting, but also dangerous. In her life, attention rarely came without cost. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple coat and shoes she'd polished the night before, as if presentation alone could protect her. When she kissed her mother's forehead goodbye, she didn't explain where she was going. She only said, "I'll be back soon." Faith, she had learned, sometimes worked best when it wasn't questioned too closely. The meeting took place in a quiet office, overlooking the city glass walls. Soft light, no visible logos. Lila sat across from two people who listened more than they spoke. They didn't interrupt her when she told the story, didn't rush her when her voice wavered. They asked about details Whitmore had never cared to hear: how long she'd worked there, how customers treated her, what exactly was said behind closed doors. When she finished, there was no dramatic reaction, just a shared look between them, followed by a single sentence that made her breath catch. This isn't the first time we've heard a story like this. Crosstown, Calvin Whitmore was discovering that control could evaporate without warning. His morning briefing with staff felt strained, the usual deference replaced by quiet unease. Employees followed orders, but something had changed in their eyes. He noticed it when he corrected a waiter's posture and received a nod that felt more mechanical than respectful. Whitmore told himself it was paranoia. Success always bred envy. Scrutiny was the price of prestige. Then the letter arrived. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't accusatory. It was written in careful professional language, requesting documentation employment. Records, termination procedures, internal policies. Whitmore read it twice, then a third time, his pulse quickening. He prided himself on running a tight ship, but even the most polished operations had corners best left unexamined. He folded the letter neatly, placed it on his desk, and stared at it as if it might disappear under enough force of will. That afternoon, a familiar name resurfaced in his thoughts, unwelcome and persistent. Dean Martin. Whitmore had dismissed the man as a relic, a pleasant memory from another era. But relics, he was learning, could still cast long shadows. And this one had connections Whitmore had underestimated. Dean, meanwhile, sat in a modest living room, far removed from spotlights, listening to an old record spin softly in the background. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made demands. He believed that real accountability didn't require spectacle, it required exposure. And exposure, once given room to breathe, did the rest on its own. He thought of Lila again, of the way she had stood her ground without defiance, how dignity had been her quiet armor. That kind of character deserved protection, not punishment. Back in Harlem, rumors finally broke the surface. A local journalist asked why Riverside Dining had suddenly postponed a community fundraiser it had sponsored for years. A former employee reached out anonymously, sharing a story eerily similar to Lila's. Another followed, then another. Each account added weight, not through outrage, but through pattern. And patterns, once visible, were impossible to unsee. Whitmore felt it most acutely that evening. Standing alone in the dining room after closing, the tables were empty, the silverware polished, the lights dimmed low. It should have felt like sanctuary. Instead, it felt like judgment. He replayed the moment he'd fired Lila, her calm request, her quiet plea. At the time, he'd seen weakness. Now, a crack appeared in that certainty. For the first time, he wondered if the image he protected so fiercely had been built on something rotten. Lila returned home that night with more questions than answers, but also with something she hadn't felt since losing her job, ground beneath her feet. She didn't know where the process would lead. She didn't know if justice would come wrapped in apology or consequence. But she knew one thing. Her story was no longer hers alone. It had become a mirror, held up for others to see themselves in. And mirrors, once raised, cannot be lowered without someone noticing. As the city settled into sleep, the quiet before revelation stretched thin. Contracts trembled on the edge of reconsideration. Reputations balanced on unspoken truths. And Whitmore, pacing his office long past midnight, began to understand a truth he had avoided his entire career, that power without compassion doesn't collapse loudly. It collapses when people finally stop looking away. The morning the truth surfaced, Harlem woke, without knowing it would be remembered. Sunlight slid between buildings like it always did, warming stoops, touching murals, waking shopkeepers who unlocked their doors with practiced motions. Riverside dining opened on time. White tablecloths crisp, silverware aligned with military precision. To anyone passing by, it looked unchanged. Inside, however, tension moved through the air like a low curtain scene. Undeniable Calvin Whitmore stood in his office, jacket perfectly pressed, hands resting on the edge of his desk. He had not slept. The night before had been filled with emails he couldn't ignore and phone calls he couldn't return fast enough. Partnerships placed on pause. A licensing review expedited. A private message from a longtime investor that ended with a sentence that would not leave his mind. Public trust is fragile. We need reassurance. Whitmore had built his life on reassurance. Now, it slipped through his fingers, down on the street. A small group gathered near the window table where Dean Martin had once sat. They weren't protesters. There were no signs, no shouting. Just neighbors, journalists, and former staff members speaking quietly to one another. Trading glances that said more than words could. A camera appeared. Then another. Not for spectacle, but for record. Inside her apartment, Lila Brooks buttoned her coat with steady hands. She had been asked to attend a meeting that morning not as an accuser, not as a symbol, but as a witness. That distinction mattered to her. Witnesses didn't need anger to be powerful. They only needed truth. Her mother squeezed her hand before she left, eyes shining with a mixture of pride and fear. "No matter what happens," she said softly, "you did right." Lila nodded. She carried that sentence with her like armor. The meeting took place in a neutral space. The kind designed to calm nerves, warm wood, muted colors, careful distance between chairs. Whitmore arrived late. When he entered, the room went still. He looked smaller than Lila remembered. Not weaker, just exposed. Titles and ownership didn't mean much here. Only actions did. When it was her turn to speak, Lila didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She told the story exactly as it happened. The kindness. The conversation. The firing. She spoke of policy without accusation, of dignity without demand. And when she finished, the silence that followed was heavy not with discomfort, but with recognition. Whitmore cleared his throat. He began with procedure, with language about standards and image. Halfway through his explanation, he stopped. The words didn't fit anymore. For the first time, he looked directly at Leela, not past her, not through her. "At her I was wrong," he said. "It wasn't loud. It wasn't rehearsed. It landed anyway." What followed was not revenge. There was no public shaming, no dramatic walkout. There were consequences, measured, undeniable. Whitmore stepped away from daily operations pending review. Riverside Dining issued a statement acknowledging harm and committing to change, not as branding, but as obligation. Policies were rewritten. Training mandated. Independent oversight introduced. Quietly, decisively. By afternoon, the story reached beyond Harlem not as scandal, but as lesson. Headlines didn't scream, they explained. And explanations, when honest, traveled far. Late that evening, Lila received a message asking her to meet someone once more. This time, the meeting place was simpler. A small cafe with mismatched chairs and music playing softly in the background. When she arrived, Dean Martin was already there. Older than when she'd last seen him, but smiling the same gentle smile. "You didn't ask me to do anything," he said after they sat. "That's why I did." She swallowed. "Thank you for seeing me." He shook his head. "Thank you for being someone worth seeing." They spoke briefly. About Harlem. About resilience. About how kindness often feels small until it isn't. When they parted, he pressed a folded note into her hand. Inside was not money. Not promises, just a line written in careful script. Character is what remains when power is removed. Weeks later, Riverside Dining reopened its doors under new leadership. The window table stayed. It was no longer reserved. Lila didn't return there as a waitress. She didn't need to. She had been offered a role elsewhere, one that valued her voice, her integrity, her experience. She accepted, not because the past demanded correction, but because the future invited growth. On a quiet afternoon, she passed Riverside Dining again. Through the glass, she saw staff laughing softly as they worked, a different energy in the room. She smiled not in triumph, but in peace. Because justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives as understanding sometimes. It arrives because one person chose kindness when it would have been easier not to. And sometimes the greatest power in the room belongs not to the owner, not to the famous name, but to the person who refused to lose themselves. Even when everything else was taken away, the end.